Well, we've been talking a lot about the rivalry between Marvel and DC Comics, but in 1975, the two companies cooperated and worked together for the first time in an idea that Stan Lee had brought to Carmine Infantino, an adaptation of The Wizard of Oz, which was in the public domain by that time. Um, they called it MGM's Marvelous Wizard of Oz. By getting the seal of MGM, they were able to use the faces of the actors from the 1939 movie. So this was written by Roy Thomas. It was penciled by John Buscema and inked by DC's Tony DeZuniga, with John Romita doing the cover, and was followed up shortly afterward by a solo Marvel sequel, The Marvelous Land of Oz. And these sold pretty well. They were in the really large tabloid-sized comics. Marvel Treasury Edition. DC was doing the same thing with reprints from older books. So these things were not sold on comic book racks, but in magazine racks. The following year, building on the success of that, it was decided by the owners of Marvel and the owners of DC to bring together their two biggest properties, Superman versus The Amazing Spider-Man, presented by DC and Marvel. This one also was very successful and pretty well done, although if you'll remember when we were talking about Earth 1, Earth 2, Earth 3, and all that stuff, these crossover events from Marvel and DC happen on a whole separate parallel Earth. So they're not part of the Marvel or DC universe. It's this other universe where all those heroes live together in the same space. Well, this one was written by Jerry Conway, who was the only person who had scripted both Superman and The Amazing Spider-Man. And it was penciled by Ross Andru, who had a long history at DC, but was now at Marvel and was the penciler for The Amazing Spider-Man. And Ross Andru had drawn both Superman and Spider-Man. It would be assumed that if you've got Ross Andru, you would have had his partner, Mike Esposito, who usually inked everything Ross Andru did. I mean, from back in the late 50s at DC with Wonder Woman all the way to The Amazing Spider-Man at this time. They're still working together. But DC wanted to have a DC inker. So Ross Andru's work was inked by Dick Giordano, who was the premier inker really at that time in either company. And I have their uncredited Neil Adams. It was years before anyone knew about Neil Adams' involvement. He came through and touched up Ross Andru's pencil work before it was inked to kind of tighten up the Superman and make him look more like the 1970s version of Superman rather than the 1960s version, which Ross Andru was basically drawing. It was edited by Stan Lee and Carmine Infantino, the publishers of each company. Now, here's a significant fact about this production. Like I said, it was decided on by the owners being Warner Communications, owners of DC Comics, and Cadence Industries, owner of Marvel Comics. And it was people at those offices that put this all together and made all the arrangements for the people to be working on it. Now, Len Wein, who at this time was the editor-in-chief of Marvel Comics, also happened to be the scripter for The Amazing Spider-Man. And he was informed by representatives from Cadence that he was going to have to get another penciler for a couple of issues because Ross Andru was going to be busy working on the Superman versus Spider-Man project. Len Wein, editor-in-chief of Marvel Comics, had never even heard of the Superman and Spider-Man project, let alone been involved in making any of the decisions about it. So he was pretty hot, and so he was telling the Cadence representative that, how dare you take away my penciler without even telling me? And he was told, and I quote, "It's none of your fucking business what we do," end quote. At which point, he physically attacked the guy, or tried to. Marv Wolfman was there, grabbing him and restraining him as he was trying to reach out and choke the guy. And this is when Len Wein quit as editor-in-chief after about a year, and was replaced by Marv Wolfman, who also lasted about a year. So it's very, very being made very, very clear who's actually in charge. Corporate headquarters is in charge, especially where their most well-known properties are concerned. Well, around that same time, a big event occurred in Marvel Comics. Jack Kirby left DC and came back to Marvel. Now, his work at DC, they had basically let him do whatever he wanted. He created the New Gods and other things, none of which ever took off, none of which ever sold very well. And so some of the folks at DC may have wondered why they had spent so much money. And Kirby wasn't really satisfied either with his relationship as it had developed with them. So at the Marvel Con Comics Convention in 1975, at the Fantastic Four panel, which Stan Lee was hosting, out walks Jack Kirby to the delight of the audience, and Stan Lee makes the announcement they are reuniting at Marvel Comics. Although they're not really reuniting, it's not going to be Stan writing. It's going to be Jack Kirby writing and penciling. So he's going to have all the credit, and he's going to get to do the whole show for the things he's involved with. And the things that he was involved with included becoming the regular, he was the whole creative team, essentially, so far as words and pencils on Captain America and the Falcon for a couple of years. He also was the writer and penciler of the Black Panther solo comic book series, which was the first regular comic book to star the Black Panther. Now, the Black Panther had been in Jungle Action for 2 or 3 years before this, but it wasn't the Black Panther comic book. It was Jungle Action, and the Black Panther happened to be the star of it. So anyway, Kirby gets to work with both of his creations here. Captain America, that he had co-created way back in 1941, and the Black Panther. He also created something completely new, the Eternals, which in some ways is very similar to DC's Fourth World and New Gods idea. So it's this idea of this race kind of halfway between human and cosmic gods. These, they're eternal, right? They are immortal humans who had been given this power by a group of giant aliens called the Celestials, who had visited Earth thousands and thousands and thousands of years ago. And as of this recording in the summer of 2020, we should be close to a release of the Marvel film version of the Eternals. Another thing that he wanted, and this was part of the deal. This is one of the things they had to do to get him to come to Marvel. He wanted to do an adaptation of the movie 2001, A Space Odyssey. Now, it was not at all unusual for for Marvel to do adaptations of movies. They had done adaptations of the Planet of the Apes movies, many others. But this movie had been out for 10 years. Now, true, they had just done this Wizard of Oz thing that had been out, at that point for 40 years. But The Wizard of Oz was a time-honored, timeless classic. 2001 is now. But at this time, it was kind of an odd choice. So they did an adaptation of 2001: A Space Odyssey in one of those Treasury editions, just like with The Wizard of Oz. And then they started a regular monthly series of 2001: A Space Odyssey, written and drawn by Jack Kirby. And in issue 8, he introduced a new character, Machine Man, which the following few issues of 2001 would feature. Actually, I think it just had 10 issues in all, but then he got his own comic. So Machine Man, who is, kind of on again, off again, been a character that shows up at Marvel and had his own book here and there, has this really weird origin where he's connected with the monolith from the movie 2001: A Space Odyssey. Now, one other thing that Kirby did while he was at Marvel, 1978, a comic book story written by Stan Lee, so co-authored by Lee and Kirby, co-plotted, Lee doing the script and Kirby the art. The Silver Surfer, The Ultimate Cosmic Experience, which was not released through Marvel Comics, even though it's Marvel-owned characters. It was released through the major New York publisher Simon & Schuster, who did hardcover books, and this made it at 114 pages, high quality, 114 pages, self-contained, really Marvel's first graphic novel, although it wasn't advertised as that because the term graphic novel hadn't quite taken hold yet. It was just kind of on the precipice of becoming a term that a lot of people were familiar with. Well, this return to Marvel Comics, which would be, the third time that Kirby had worked exclusively at Marvel over a 40-year period. It left Jack Kirby feeling unsatisfied still. And his books that he did at Marvel, like the ones he did at DC, didn't quite catch on. So he wound up getting involved in 1978 in the production of the new Fantastic Four animated series, which Stan Lee was actually writing the scripts for. So the two of them are involved again with the Fantastic Four. Although this time they didn't have the Human Torch. The Human Torch was in the first Fantastic Four cartoon 10 years before, but at this point, the Hanna-Barbera, the producers of the show, thought that showing like 5-year-old kids a cartoon about a guy who catches on fire and isn't that cool might not be the greatest idea, because some kid somewhere is going to set himself on fire because he wants to be the Human Torch, and then they're all going to get sued. So the fourth member of the Fantastic Four became this comedy relief goofy robot called Herbie. That was embarrassing. The character briefly showed up in the Fantastic Four comics, not as a character, but as just something that Reed Richards was experimenting with. Anyway, Kirby felt good about the work he was doing as the art production designer on this cartoon for Hanna-Barbera, and he actually was offered a job by Hanna-Barbera, and he took it. So he left comics and went into animation, where he would work on various Hanna-Barbera Saturday morning cartoons, including Thundar the Barbarian. this would not be a permanent departure from comics. By the 1980s, he's going to be back again, but not in the same way as previous. He's not going to be at Marvel or DC. All right, well, now let's talk about the DC explosion, which is something that frequently comes up in comic book histories. This is a significant event. Well, not the explosion so much as what comes after. Now, after DC fell behind Marvel for the first time in 1972, now they're having to play catch up. By 1975-76, they're taking some long shot gambles, and they are introducing more and more new titles. Remember, Marvel expanded their market share when they were able to have more titles finally. So DC basically doubles the number of different titles they put out every month, with the biggest push coming in the summer of 1977 in what they were advertising as the DC explosion. More pages, more stories. Watch for full details. Well, this was, like I say, this was a big gamble that they were pretty confident in. Introduced a lot of new characters. It was during this period that they introduced Black Lightning, for instance. And also, this was when they introduced a new character who started right off in his own title, Firestorm, the Nuclear Man, who would become kind of a mainstay in the DC universe. And he's got nuclear powers, but kind of an interesting take on a superhero. He's sort of like Captain Marvel, Shazam, Billy Batson in reverse, because Firestorm is a high school student, a teenager, who, because of this accident involving him and a scientist, he gets these powers, and also the scientist lives inside his mind. So the scientist is dead, but his consciousness resides inside Firestorm. And so the teenager and the middle-aged scientist are always talking back and forth, but no one else can hear them. Well, the timing on all this was not good. First issue of Firestorm, the Nuclear Man, cover dated March 1978. That means it actually came out December or January. The winter of 1977-1978 was probably the worst winter in the last 50 years. It was full of blizzards. In fact, the whole winter was one big months-long blizzard. And to give you an idea of what I'm talking about, Tennessee was getting 8-9 inches of snow, right? Tennessee ordinarily at that time period might get 1 or 2 snows per winter, and they might be a couple of inches. So I mean, it was heavy snow all winter long, which, if you were 9 years old like me, was the most wonderful thing ever, right? Because you weren't in school, you were outside playing in the snow all winter long, just like you lived in, New York or Minnesota or something. But there's a problem. There's a problem there. With all this snow, people weren't getting out much. People weren't going to the grocery store as often. They weren't taking their kids with them. So the kids weren't getting out to the places where there were comic books. And comic book sales that winter plummeted. Now, Marvel ate a bit of a loss. But that's one thing. DC had just basically invested everything they had in all these brand new titles, which means, no one is subscribing to these titles because they just came out. And it's really imperative that they be discovered. They be discovered in the stores, and they were not. So DC took a bath. They took a snowy bath. And what they had heralded as the DC explosion instead became referred to sarcastically as the DC implosion. because they wound up canceling 31 titles, roughly the same number of new titles that they had introduced over the previous couple of years. So I have highlighted and read some of the titles we've talked about before that should look familiar to you. There's the New Gods that Jack Kirby had done that was still struggling along without him, and various others, including Batman Family, which was a double-sized comic book that had stories about Batman and stories separately about Robin and Batgirl. They almost canceled Detective Comics, and there was enough pushback from the creative side of things and from the editorial side, not the management side. They convinced them to sacrifice Batman Family instead of Detective Comics, which is a good thing. So this was a huge setback for DC and put them even further behind Marvel. And by the way, if you're looking over this list of comics, there's Our Fighting Forces. I should have highlighted that one. This is when, and Our Army at War. Welcome Back, Kotter. Yes, they had a comic book version of the popular TV show starring John Travolta, Welcome Back, Kotter. But that went out the window in 1978. It was almost kind of symbolic in 1977 when DC lost the license to the Edgar Rice Burroughs characters. Predominantly Tarzan, who had been the star of comic books put out by Dell, then by Gold Key, for decades, from 1948 on. Then in 1972, Gold Key had lost that license, and DC had scooped it up. And so DC was making Tarzan comics. It was penciled by Joe Kubert. But 1977, it switches over, and now Marvel has Tarzan, with John Buscema bringing his Conan the Barbarian approach to Tarzan, Lord of the Jungle. And of course that also means that they got access to Edgar Rice Burroughs' other famous character, John Carter, Warlord of Mars. Now, notice in this January 1978 issue, down at the bottom, how they have a little bit of a dig at DC and their alleged explosion. Well, over at DC, Jeanette Kahn had taken over as publisher in 1976. We talked about her back when we discussed significant and important women in the history of comics. So she wound up being publisher and president and editor-in-chief of DC. So she comes on board as they're gearing up for the DC explosion. So she was at the helm for that, but she didn't take a fall for it. They still had confidence in her. So she's continuing to move forward in charge, and will for decades. Over at Marvel, well, Stan Lee became publisher back in 1972, and Roy Thomas took over as editor-in-chief for a couple of years, and he didn't like it. And Len Wein took over for about a year, and he quit. Marv Wolfman took over for about a year, and he didn't like it. Jerry Conway took over for about 6 weeks, and nobody liked it. And Archie Goodwin took over, and he didn't even like the idea of taking over. He had experience. He had been the editor-in-chief of Warren magazines back in the 60s, and therefore he knew he didn't want this job. He wanted to be a focus on his writing, so he only took over with the understanding it was temporary until they found someone else, and they didn't seem to be trying to find anybody else. So after 2 years, at the end of 1977, he stepped down, and Jim Shooter wound up taking over as editor-in-chief of Marvel, and that's going to bring some stability to the position because he's going to be in charge for several years. Now, he's taking over at a moment in time where, in large part due to DC's implosion, Marvel now has a huge lead over DC. They had surpassed DC back in 72, 73. By 78, they have way surpassed DC. And in fact, Marvel has 50% of the comic book market. That puts them just slightly better positioned than DC had been back in 1965-66. So half of all comic books sold are made by Marvel. The other half are made by everybody else. DC, of course, was the biggest chunk of the everybody else, but they're still everybody else. Now, Jim Shooter was a relatively young guy, and yet he had been in the business for years. He actually got his start as a writer at DC, as a freelance writer. He sold several stories to Action Comics and Adventure Comics in 1965 when he was 14 years old, and did quite a few stories. Actually, he became the regular writer over at Adventure Comics, doing the Legion of Superheroes. Spent a little time trying to make it in the advertising business, and then came back into comics. And in 1975, when Marv Wolfman had been editor-in-chief, he brought Jim Shooter on board as an editorial assistant. And the turnover at the top was so quick that within 3 years, he was in charge of everything, at least everything comics concerned. Stan Lee, of course, is out in Hollywood pursuing the other stuff. So, some of the things that happened during Jim Shooter's tenure, actually there's going to be a lot, but we're going to look at the stuff that's taken place right around 1980, late 70s, early 80s. Probably the most significant thing was the skyrocketing popularity of the X-Men, which had been just kind of barely struggling along back in the 60s, and in the 70s almost got canceled. Then 1975, remember, Len Wein and Dave Cockrum introduced the new X-Men in Giant Size X-Men #1. Then the following month, in the regular X-Men book number 94, Chris Claremont took over as a writer, so he's the one that really developed the personalities of these characters. Dave Cockrum eventually moved on, and the creative team by the late 70s on X-Men was, well, what's going to become one of the most famous creative teams ever. And we've talked about Lee and Kirby, and Simon and Kirby, and Siegel and Schuster. Claremont, Byrne, and Austin ranked pretty high as well. Now, John Byrne was Canadian, and that is going to factor into the things the X-Men get involved with Wolverine, the first Marvel Canadian superhero, and then later a whole team of Canadian superheroes created by Claremont and Byrne. So Terry Austin inking Byrne's pencils really brought out the best of them. And there's a very, very distinctive look. Byrne himself has a distinctive look in his pencils, but Byrne and Austin together just really, really snapped off the page. So there was kind of a slow burn, 1978, 1979, as the X-Men were getting more popular. And then in 1980, the storyline, the multi-part storyline, the Dark Phoenix saga, where Jean Grey, formerly Marvel Girl, now Phoenix, goes rogue and turns bad and tries to destroy the universe. And it's a tragic, tragic story. And I can tell you that at that time I was 12 years old, and I had a subscription to X-Men, and this was like a 6-part story. So waiting for that to arrive in the mailbox each month to find out what was going to happen was it was torture. Well, the Dark Phoenix saga was immediately followed by another famous storyline, Days of Future Past, when someone from the future comes back to warn the X-Men that the robot Sentinels are going to set up concentration camps for mutants. And both of those storylines have been made in the movies, Dark Phoenix, twice actually. So by 1981, the Uncanny X-Men has gone from being on the verge of cancellation a decade earlier to being wildly, wildly popular, the most popular comic book out there. And it was really just seemingly overnight, but like I said, it had been a slow burn. Meanwhile, over in the pages of Daredevil, something similar had happened. Daredevil always been kind of a second string superhero. He had managed to hold on to his own title ever since he was introduced back in the 60s, but it had gone bi-monthly, which is usually not a good sign. That's a sign this circulation of a book is not good. Until Frank Miller came on board. Frank Miller initially came as penciler, and Joe Rubinstein did most of the inks during Miller's run. But within a few issues, he took over as writer as well. And during this time, you had the storyline that introduced Daredevil's old girlfriend, who's now a ninja assassin, Elektra, who is being pursued by the bad ninjas, the ninjas known as the Hand. And in this storyline, we learn more about Matt Murdock, or Daredevil's background. We learned that he was trained in the martial arts by a mysterious blind man named Stick, because he had a wooden cane, right? So in the ensuing couple of years, with Miller taking over, Daredevil also became wildly popular. This issue in particular, when you have a face-off between Daredevil and anti-hero the Punisher, who's also starting to become very popular. So that's going on at Marvel. Over at DC, George Perez, whom we discussed before, this is when he takes over the new Teen Titans. Now, Teen Titans had started back in the 60s, and their book got canceled in the DC implosion. And kind of like with the X-Men, they were kind of resurrected with a new team that had some of the old members, but also a bunch of new members. And with George Perez's artwork, again, really making this stuff snap, really making it stand out, the new Teen Titans became far and away the most popular thing DC had. So a kind of a similar vibe to the X-Men. The X-Men had started off as all teenagers, but the new group weren't necessarily teenagers. They all seemed to be quite a bit older. Then in 1982, the X-Men and the Teen Titans meet in another one of these Marvel DC crossovers, bringing back Dark Phoenix teaming up with Darkseid from DC. So those are the three books that were wildly, wildly popular in the early 80s. You've got teenagers over there with the Teen Titans. You have mutants with the X-Men. And you've got ninjas with Daredevil. So when you put together teenagers, mutants, and ninjas, all you got to do is add turtles, and this is what you've got. This independent comic by Eastman and Laird, which we'll talk about in more detail later when we're talking about the independent comics movement in the 80s. But I will tell you that the comic book version, the original comic book version of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, was nothing like the movies and cartoons. It was not kid-oriented, nor was it funny. It was played very, very serious, but they were turtles. And essentially, what Eastman and Laird were doing were they were satirizing, they were lampooning the things that were popular at the time they made this book. Teenagers, mutants, and ninjas. And the fact that you make them turtles, it just becomes kind of surreal and absurd and ridiculous, and yet it's played so seriously, just like those other books. That's kind of the point. And it's kind of weird that so many people over the last 30 years have come to recognize the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and are familiar now with the X-Men, Daredevil, and the Teen Titans. But most people don't realize that it's all tied together. By the way, just in case you think that all that stuff I just listed is a coincidence, bear in mind Daredevil had a sensei who was a homeless blind guy named Stick, and they fought ninjas called the Hand. And the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles had a sensei who was a rat named Splinter, and they fought bad guy ninjas called the Foot. I'm just saying.